It was just another ordinary morning in a sleek, corporate office building, with the hum of the city outside and the soft clatter of keyboards filling the air. The receptionist, a young woman with a quick smile and a sharper tongue, was seated behind her desk, flipping through a magazine. Her job was simple: check in visitors, answer calls, and keep things running smoothly. But today, a new arrival was about to change everything. The doors swung open, and a woman stepped inside. She was dressed modestly, her clothing nothing special, just a plain dress and a pair of shoes that looked well worn. But what caught the receptionist's attention wasn't her clothes or appearance, it was the woman's presence. She carried herself with an air of quiet confidence that felt out of place in the bustling office. The receptionist looked her up and down, a slight smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. She had seen countless people come through the lobby, many of them far more put together than this woman. Without a second thought, she leaned forward, resting her chin in her hand. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone dripping with disinterest. The woman smiled, but it was a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm here for a meeting," she said, her voice calm, almost too calm. The receptionist raised an eyebrow. "A meeting? With whom?" She scanned the office lobby, as though expecting some sort of high-powered executive to walk in with a suit and tie, not this unassuming woman. "Mr. Andrews," the woman replied, her voice unwavering. The receptionist's eyes narrowed. She knew Mr. Andrews, the CEO of the company. A powerful man, with connections that reached far beyond these walls. She couldn't imagine him scheduling a meeting with someone who looked like she had just stepped off a bus. "Mr. Andrews?" "Sure, okay," the receptionist said, her tone laced with sarcasm. "I'm sure he's just waiting for you. Let me check his calendar." As she pretended to type on the computer, the woman stood quietly, watching the receptionist with an unreadable expression. There was a faint air of superiority in her calmness, which only seemed to annoy the receptionist more. She couldn't help but judge the woman, thinking how out of place she seemed. After a moment, the receptionist glanced up, a mischievous glint in her eyes. "You know," she said, leaning back in her chair, "I don't know who you are, but I highly doubt Mr. Andrews has time for you. Maybe you should leave before you embarrass yourself." The woman's smile didn't falter. Instead, she simply nodded, as though accepting the receptionist's words without offense. "Thank you," she said quietly, turning to leave. But just as she reached the door, something about the situation felt wrong. There was something off about the receptionist's smug demeanor, the way she judged the woman without knowing a single thing about her. The woman paused for a second, looking over her shoulder. "You'll see," she said, her voice low and filled with an almost eerie certainty. "You'll see who I am soon enough." The receptionist shrugged, dismissing her words with a laugh. "Sure, lady. Whatever you say." As the door swung shut behind the woman, the receptionist went back to her magazine, feeling satisfied. She had made her point, and she didn't think twice about it. The woman was gone, and everything in the lobby was back to normal. But what the receptionist didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known, was that the woman's words weren't just a warning, they were a prelude to a shocking revelation that would change everything. The encounter was far from over. Days passed, and the memory of the strange woman seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the usual bustle of office life. The receptionist had long since forgotten the brief encounter, dismissing it as one of those odd, unimportant moments that came with the job. She had plenty of her own worries, after all, managing the hectic schedule, keeping up with calls, and making sure the lobby remained orderly. But little did she know, that brief encounter would soon come back to haunt her. It was a Tuesday morning when the woman returned. The receptionist, lost in thought, didn't notice the soft click of the doors until the woman was already standing before her desk. Her appearance was the same, simple, modest clothes, her presence still as calm as it had been days before. But something was different this time. The receptionist couldn't put her finger on it, but the woman seemed somehow more confident, more assured. The receptionist, still caught off guard, shot a quick glance up at the woman, then back to her computer. "Oh, it's you again," she muttered, not looking up from her screen. "Didn't I tell you before that Mr. Andrews doesn't have time for meetings like yours?" The woman didn't respond immediately. She simply smiled faintly, the same enigmatic smile that had caused the receptionist to feel so uncomfortable the last time. And then, without a word, she took a step closer to the desk, her gaze steady, her posture calm. "Can I help you?" the receptionist asked, her tone more curt now. Her patience was wearing thin, and she was in no mood for any more games. "I'm here for Mr. Andrews," the woman replied softly. "And I'm not leaving until I see him." The receptionist scoffed, leaning back in her chair. "I told you already," she said, the irritation evident in her voice. "You're wasting my time. Why don't you just go home?" The woman's eyes flickered, just for a moment, with something the receptionist couldn't quite decipher. It was like a shadow passing over her face, something hidden, something powerful. The receptionist had no idea that the woman she was dismissing so carelessly was not who she appeared to be. With a sigh, the receptionist stood and walked toward the phone, ready to call security and have the woman escorted out, but as she reached for the receiver, something caught her attention. The woman was still standing there, unwavering, her presence filling the room. And then, before the receptionist could stop herself, a voice interrupted. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," the woman said quietly. The receptionist froze. It wasn't just the calmness in her voice, it was the tone, the subtle threat hidden beneath the words. There was something commanding in her voice now, something that didn't belong in this lowly office. The receptionist raised an eyebrow. "What are you talking about?" she asked, trying to brush off the unease creeping into her chest. But the woman didn't reply immediately. Instead, she looked down at her phone, tapping the screen with her finger. For a moment, it seemed like nothing was happening, until the receptionist's phone rang. A number she didn't recognize. She hesitated before picking it up, glancing at the woman with confusion. "Hello?" she answered, her voice low. "You need to let her in," a voice on the other end of the line said. It was a man's voice, deep, calm, and unmistakable. "She has an appointment with Mr. Andrews. And trust me, you don't want to stop her from meeting him." The receptionist's heart skipped a beat. She knew that voice. It was Mr. Andrews. Her mouth went dry. "Mr. Andrews," she stammered, glancing nervously at the woman who was still standing there, an unreadable expression on her face. "Let her through," Mr. Andrews's voice came again, this time more forceful. "Now." The phone clicked as the line went dead. The receptionist's mind was racing. What was going on? The woman? She couldn't possibly, but before she could gather her thoughts, the woman smiled at her, a small, knowing smile that sent a chill down the receptionist's spine. "Don't worry," the woman said softly. "I think it's time for you to meet the real me." The receptionist stood frozen, staring at the woman in shock. Her world was about to turn upside down, but she couldn't know just how deep she was about to be pulled into a story that would forever change her life. The receptionist stood there, speechless, her hand still gripping the phone. She had always prided herself on being in control, on handling the chaos of her job with ease. But now, standing in front of this mysterious woman, she felt completely out of her depth. There was a stillness in the air, a quiet intensity that made her feel as though something monumental was about to happen. The woman, seeing the receptionist's hesitation, took a step forward. Her calm, composed demeanor remained unshaken, and the receptionist felt a flicker of unease that grew with every passing second. She could see it now, there was something different about this woman. Something hidden beneath her unassuming appearance. "You don't have to do anything," the woman said softly, almost as if she could read the receptionist's mind. "I'm not here to cause trouble." The receptionist wanted to say something, to protest, to demand answers, but the words caught in her throat. How could she not have known who this woman was? How could she have been so dismissive, so wrong about someone who now seemed to hold more power than she could ever have imagined? Before the receptionist could respond, the woman held up her hand, signaling her to stop. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a quiet command that made the receptionist freeze in place. "You think you've won, don't you?" the woman continued, her voice low and controlled. "You think you've gotten the best of me. But the truth is, you don't know who I really am." For a brief moment, the receptionist's heart raced. She had assumed this woman was just another low-level visitor who had no place in the world of high-profile meetings and corporate politics. But as she stood before her now, the receptionist realized that her assumptions were dangerously wrong. The woman smiled, but it was not a smile of triumph. It was a knowing smile, one that seemed to hold a secret, something far beyond the receptionist's understanding. "You'll learn who I am soon enough," she said quietly. With a final glance at the receptionist, the woman turned toward the elevator. The receptionist, still in shock, watched her every move, unable to shake the feeling that this moment, this encounter, was about to become something far greater than she could have ever anticipated. As the woman stepped into the elevator, the doors closed with a soft chime. The receptionist stood frozen for a moment, still processing everything that had just happened. Her mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle of the woman's words and the strange turn of events. She had no idea what was coming next, but one thing was certain: this was far from over. The receptionist picked up her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed the number for Mr. Andrews. As the line rang, she wondered what she had gotten herself into. What was the real identity of this woman? And why had Mr. Andrews been so insistent on meeting with her? "Mr. Andrews," she said when the call was answered. I don't understand. Who is she? Why was she here?" There was a brief silence on the other end of the line before Mr. Andrews' voice came through, colder than usual. "Forget about it," he said, his tone sharp. "You'll understand soon enough." And with that, he hung up. The receptionist stood in stunned silence, her mind reeling. The truth was slipping through her fingers like sand, and she knew she was about to be swept into something she couldn't control. Her gut told her that the woman's words were more than just idle threats, they were a warning. A warning that the world she thought she knew was about to unravel in ways she couldn't possibly imagine. The next few days felt like a blur to the receptionist. She couldn't stop thinking about the woman, about the encounter, the cryptic words, the chilling smile that had lingered in her mind long after the woman had left. It was as if a veil had been lifted, and now she saw the office in a completely different light. Every conversation, every look exchanged between coworkers seemed full of hidden meaning, as if she were surrounded by people playing roles in a story she wasn't yet part of. Then, on the 5th day after the woman's unexpected visit, the receptionist was sitting at her desk, going through the usual motions, when she heard the doors swing open again. She didn't look up immediately, assuming it was another businessperson entering the building. But as the footsteps grew closer, she froze. The air in the lobby seemed to grow heavy, charged with something she couldn't name. She looked up and felt her heart skip a beat. It was her. The woman. But this time, the woman wasn't alone. The receptionist's gaze flicked from the woman to the figure walking beside her, a tall man dressed in an immaculate suit. His presence was commanding, his every movement calculated and precise, as if he belonged to a world far beyond the office's polished glass doors. He exuded an aura of power, a contrast to the woman's quiet calm. The receptionist's breath caught in her throat. What was happening? Who was this man, and why was he with the woman? The woman had been so calm, so composed, but this time she seemed different. There was a quiet confidence in her step, and the way she carried herself was almost regal. The receptionist felt a pang of unease twist in her stomach. They walked toward the front desk, and the receptionist, still paralyzed with uncertainty, instinctively stood up to greet them. But the woman didn't make eye contact with her this time. Instead, she moved to the side and spoke to the tall man beside her. "Mr. Andrews is expecting us," the woman said, her voice cool but filled with an undercurrent of command. The receptionist's jaw tightened. There was no doubt now, this was no ordinary visitor. The man beside her gave a slight nod, his expression unreadable. "Lead the way." The receptionist's mouth went dry. She knew what this meant. Mr. Andrews was expecting them, but it wasn't the woman's simple presence that had warranted such an audience. No, there was something more to it, something deeper than she could comprehend. It was as if the entire air in the room had shifted, and the receptionist, who had once felt in control, now felt completely out of her depth. She didn't have the nerve to stop them. She couldn't bring herself to ask who they were. Instead, she silently ushered them to the elevator, her mind racing as she watched them disappear behind the elevator doors. The woman's words from days ago echoed in her mind, "You'll see who I am soon enough." As the elevator doors closed, the receptionist stood frozen in place, staring at the empty space where the woman and the man had been just moments before. A sense of foreboding crept over her, and she knew, deep down, that her life was about to take a turn she hadn't seen coming. For the first time, she felt as though she were merely a bystander in a much bigger story, one she had unknowingly stepped into. And she couldn't shake the feeling that the next few moments would reveal a truth so staggering, it would change everything. The minutes felt like hours as the receptionist stood in the lobby, her mind racing. What had just happened? Who was that woman? Who was the man with her? And why had Mr. Andrews been so insistent on letting them through? Her thoughts were interrupted when the elevator doors opened again, but this time, it was different. The atmosphere felt heavier, charged with an energy she couldn't explain. The woman stepped out first, her presence now unmistakably commanding. She was followed by the tall man, whose stoic expression didn't soften even a little. And then, to the receptionist's shock, the woman turned to her and spoke in a tone that was both calm and authoritative. "You should come with us," the woman said, her words like an invitation, but there was something in her voice that left no room for refusal. The receptionist's heart raced. She wanted to protest, to refuse, but the command in the woman's voice made her hesitate. Her eyes flicked toward the front office, wondering if she could find some excuse, but she knew deep down that this was beyond her control. She had no idea who these people were, but she had already sensed that refusing them would be a grave mistake. Swallowing her fear, the receptionist nodded and began walking behind them, her steps slow and unsure. They passed through the long hallways, the silence between them deafening, each step bringing her closer to something she wasn't prepared to face. When they reached the large conference room, Mr. Andrews was already there, standing at the head of the table. The CEO's eyes flicked up as they entered, and he didn't even acknowledge the receptionist. His gaze was focused entirely on the woman who had accompanied the tall man. The receptionist froze in the doorway, unsure of what to do. She had never seen Mr. Andrews so small. It was as if he were suddenly a different man, nervous, almost intimidated. His posture was rigid, and the energy in the room was thick with tension. "Ah, you've arrived," Mr. Andrews said, his voice tight, his usual commanding tone now replaced by something else. He didn't look at the receptionist, but at the woman. "Of course," the woman replied calmly, taking her seat at the table. "It's been a long time." The receptionist, standing awkwardly by the door, could only stare. She tried to process the words, the cold exchange, the strange familiarity in the way they spoke to each other, but nothing made sense. "You've grown well, haven't you?" Mr. Andrews said, his voice soft but strained. The receptionist felt her stomach twist with confusion. What did he mean by that? The woman didn't appear to be anything extraordinary, yet here they were, in a room with one of the most powerful men in the company, and he was acting like a student in the presence of a teacher. The woman smiled faintly. "I've learned a lot, Mr. Andrews. More than you might expect." The tension in the room was palpable. The receptionist felt as though she were witnessing something personal, something that had nothing to do with her but was somehow unfolding right before her eyes. And then, the woman turned to the receptionist, as if remembering her presence for the first time. Her eyes met the receptionist's, and there was something unspoken there, something that made the receptionist shiver. "You were quite rude to me the other day," the woman said, her voice even, but her words hit like a punch. "Do you know who I am now?" The receptionist blinked, unsure of how to respond. The last few days had thrown her into a whirlwind, but this was something she wasn't prepared for. The woman leaned forward, her gaze never leaving the receptionist. "I think it's time you learned the truth. I am the majority shareholder of this company. Mr. Andrews is just a puppet, a figurehead who's kept in place by people like me." The words crashed over the receptionist like a wave. Her mind struggled to catch up, but the weight of what the woman had said was undeniable. The receptionist had no idea that the woman standing before her was the one pulling the strings behind the scenes. As the silence settled in the room, the receptionist's eyes darted between the woman and Mr. Andrews. The power dynamics had shifted completely. What had once seemed like a normal office, with a strict hierarchy and predictable rules, had been turned upside down. The woman leaned back in her chair, her calm gaze never leaving the receptionist. "You see," she continued, "you were too quick to judge me, to dismiss me. And now, here I am, in the place where I belong." The receptionist's heart was pounding in her chest. She felt a wave of shame wash over her, realizing how wrong she had been, how badly she had misjudged this woman. She had no idea what had just happened or how much further this story was about to unfold, but one thing was clear: she had just glimpsed the tip of a very large iceberg. The words hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating the space around the receptionist. She could feel the weight of the woman's revelation sinking in, and her mind raced, trying to process the fact that she had just insulted someone of such incredible power. The world she had known, where she was the one in control of the lobby, the one who made the first impression, had been a fragile illusion. Now, everything felt different. The woman, the so-called majority shareholder, remained poised in her chair, her gaze steady and unwavering. Mr. Andrews sat at the table, his shoulders slumped, his hands clasped tightly in front of him as if he were trying to appear composed despite the storm that had just erupted in the room. For a moment, everything was silent. The receptionist could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, thudding louder than ever. She felt the sting of embarrassment, a heat creeping up her neck as she stood frozen in the doorway. How could she have been so blind? How could she have judged this woman, dismissed her as nothing more than an unimportant visitor? The woman's eyes softened, almost imperceptibly, as she watched the receptionist's internal struggle. "I understand your position," she said, her voice almost too calm. "It's easy to judge someone based on appearances, to think that because someone looks a certain way, they must belong in a certain place." The receptionist opened her mouth to apologize, to make things right, but the words got stuck in her throat. What could she possibly say? She had already crossed a line that couldn't be undone. "Don't waste your apology," the woman said, cutting her off before she could speak. Her tone wasn't unkind, but it was firm. "The damage is done. What's more important now is what you choose to do next." The receptionist swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her mistake settling on her shoulders like a heavy burden. She could barely meet the woman's eyes, but she knew that this was the moment that would define her future. There was no turning back from this. The world she had once thought she understood had just opened up in front of her, revealing an entirely different truth, and she was left to navigate this new reality. The woman leaned back in her chair, her posture regal and composed. She gave the receptionist a long, searching look. "I don't expect you to understand everything right now," she continued. But I hope that you'll learn from this. The world is full of assumptions, and sometimes, we make choices based on those assumptions without realizing the consequences. The receptionist nodded slowly, a feeling of shame crawling over her like a heavy cloak. She had assumed so much. Assumed that the woman was just another low-level office visitor, assumed that she could be ignored, written off. But now, that assumption seemed foolish. The woman had shown her the depths of her mistake, and now she had to live with it. As if sensing the receptionist's turmoil, Mr. Andrews finally spoke up. His voice, though quieter than usual, had an edge to it now. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, his eyes briefly meeting the receptionist's. "The truth is, you never really knew who was in control here. None of us did. But now, you're seeing it firsthand." The receptionist's stomach twisted in discomfort. She had spent so long in this office, believing she knew how things worked, believing that the CEO was the one calling the shots. But now, it was clear that she had been wrong. All this time, she had been looking in the wrong direction. The woman stood from her seat, her movements graceful and deliberate. "I'll give you a moment to reflect on this," she said to the receptionist, her voice softer now, but with a quiet authority. "And when you're ready, we can talk about the future. But for now, just know this, appearances are deceiving. And it's time to stop seeing things as you've always seen them." With that, she turned to leave, and Mr. Andrews followed her without a word. The receptionist stood in the conference room, her hands trembling at her sides, unsure of what to do next. She had just learned a valuable lesson, but at what cost? For the rest of the day, she couldn't shake the feeling of regret that lingered in her chest. Every time she passed someone in the hallway, she wondered if they were judging her the way she had judged the woman. It was a feeling she wasn't used to, vulnerable, exposed, ashamed. But in a way, it was also a feeling that changed her. She couldn't go back to the way things were. The world she had thought she knew had been cracked open, and now, there was no going back to her old, comfortable existence. The lesson she had learned was clear: never judge someone based on what you see on the outside. There was always more beneath the surface. And now, she had to decide how she would move forward, with the knowledge of her mistake weighing on her. The days that followed were a blur for the receptionist. She couldn't escape the feeling of having been in the dark for so long, blindly following the flow of office life without truly understanding the forces at play around her. She had spent so many years working in this building, doing her job, feeling in control of the small space she occupied. But now, she understood just how much of it had been an illusion. The woman, the majority shareholder, had shifted everything. The receptionist had felt her power, felt the weight of the decisions she could make with a single word. But that power was not just something that had belonged to the woman. It was something that had been here all along, hidden beneath the surface. And now, the receptionist had to come to terms with the fact that she was no longer just an observer of this world, she was part of it. It was late afternoon when the woman came back, this time alone. The receptionist had been staring out the window, lost in thought, when the soft click of the door opening brought her back to reality. She looked up, startled, but quickly masked her surprise as the woman stepped inside. She still looked calm, poised, as if the weight of everything that had just transpired didn't affect her in the slightest. "I know you've been thinking about what I said," the woman began, her voice soft but firm. "And I want you to understand, this is not just about me. This is about how the world works. How people in power, those who really control things, live in the shadows. You were only seeing a fraction of the picture before." The receptionist couldn't meet her gaze. She felt exposed, as if the woman could see straight through her, into the very core of her regrets. "I was wrong," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I shouldn't have judged you." The woman's eyes softened, and she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "We all make mistakes," she said. "The important thing is how we grow from them." What matters now is how you choose to move forward. The receptionist took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. How do I move forward? She asked, her voice shaky. I feel like everything I thought I knew, it's all changed. The woman smiled faintly, as though she had been waiting for this question. That's the point, she said. You've had your eyes opened. You've seen the truth, even if it's uncomfortable. And now, you have the power to make a choice. You can choose to stay where you are, to cling to the past, or you can choose to see things differently, to step into the light of what you now know. The receptionist felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in a long time, hope. The woman's words, though quiet and calm, carried a weight of possibility that made her believe there was more for her in this world than she had ever thought possible. But it wasn't just about the office anymore. It was about her life. Her choices. The way she had allowed herself to be complacent, to live in the shadow of what others had decided for her. And now, she realized, she had the opportunity to make her own decisions. I want to learn, the receptionist said, her voice steadying as the words came out. I want to understand more, to see what I've been missing. The woman nodded approvingly. Good. You're on the right path. The real question is, what will you do with the knowledge you have now? The power you've seen? The receptionist stood a little taller. She had no answers yet, but she knew she was ready to start asking the right questions. The world outside the office still seemed vast, uncertain, but for the first time, she didn't feel so small. As the woman turned to leave, she gave the receptionist a final piece of advice. Remember this, she said. The truth doesn't always come easily. Sometimes, it takes a long time to understand it. But once you do, you'll never be able to go back to the way things were. So make your choice wisely. With that, the woman left the office, her footsteps fading down the hallway. The receptionist stood alone in the quiet room, her mind buzzing with thoughts and possibilities. The shift in power was no longer something that happened outside of her, it was within her. And for the first time in a long while, she felt ready to take control of her future. The receptionist spent the next few days reflecting deeply on the conversation she had with the woman. There were moments when the weight of everything still felt overwhelming, but she was slowly coming to terms with her place in this world that had once seemed so distant and beyond her reach. It was like waking up from a dream and realizing that the life she thought she knew was nothing more than a facade, an illusion that had been shattered. She noticed a shift in herself too. She no longer felt like a passive observer in the office. Every conversation, every decision made around her, felt charged with the new knowledge she had gained. She was more aware, more attuned to the undercurrents of power that flowed through the company. And though she didn't yet understand all the intricacies of the corporate world, she was beginning to see the puzzle pieces fall into place. But just as she was starting to find her footing, the final confrontation came. It was an ordinary morning, just like any other, when the door to the office swung open and, to the receptionist's shock, in walked the woman once again. But this time, she wasn't alone. The tall man, the one who had accompanied her before, was back by her side. They both entered with an air of quiet authority, and for the first time, the receptionist felt her pulse quicken in anticipation. There was something different about today, something that felt like the culmination of everything that had happened. Without a word, the woman and the man moved toward the elevator, heading toward Mr. Andrews's office. The receptionist watched them, her heart pounding. She felt a sense of urgency, as if she were standing on the edge of a precipice. She had no idea what this meeting was about, but she knew it would be the turning point in everything. As they entered the elevator, the receptionist made a snap decision. She couldn't just stand by and let this moment slip away. She had to confront the truth, confront the woman, and finally understand what had been happening behind the scenes all along. Gathering her courage, she walked quickly to the elevator, catching it just before the doors closed. The woman glanced at her as she stepped in, her expression unreadable. For a brief second, the receptionist hesitated, but then she spoke. "I need to understand," she said, her voice steady but filled with the weight of her questions. "I need to know what's going on. What's your real purpose here? Why are you doing this?" The woman didn't seem surprised by the question. In fact, she appeared almost relieved that the receptionist had asked it. She glanced at the tall man beside her, who nodded as if giving his approval. "It's time you understood everything," the woman said, her voice calm but authoritative. "There are forces at play in this building, in this company, that most people don't see. People like Mr. Andrews, people like you, you've been pawns in a game that has been going on for years. But no longer." The receptionist's mind raced. The words were cryptic, but the meaning was clear. The woman was revealing something much bigger than she had ever imagined. This wasn't just about an office or a company, it was about power, control, and influence on a scale she hadn't even begun to grasp. The woman continued, her gaze fixed on the receptionist. "This company, this empire we've built, it's not what it seems. But soon, you'll see how it all fits together. You'll understand why you've been kept in the dark." Mr. Andrews's voice came from behind them, his tone uncharacteristically tense. "What's going on here? This is supposed to be a private matter." The woman turned to face him, her demeanor unwavering. "It's too late to hide the truth now. Everything is coming to the surface, and whether you're ready or not, you'll have to face it." The receptionist felt the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. She had walked into this elevator unsure of what was going to happen, but now she could feel the gravity of the situation pressing down on her. This was more than just a confrontation, it was a revelation. It was the moment everything came to light. The elevator doors opened, and they stepped out into the hallway, where Mr. Andrews's office loomed ahead. The receptionist, with a deep breath, followed them, ready for whatever was about to unfold. She had no idea what would happen next, but one thing was certain, she was no longer a passive observer. She was part of this story now, and whatever the truth was, she was going to face it head-on. As they walked down the long corridor toward Mr. Andrews's office, the receptionist felt her heartbeat quicken with each step. She could feel the air around her thick with anticipation, like the calm before a storm. Everything she had seen, everything she had learned, was building up to this moment. She had come so far, and yet, the question still loomed large in her mind. What was the truth? What had she missed all these years? When they reached the office, the receptionist stood just outside the door, hesitating for a moment. She wasn't sure if she was ready to face what lay beyond. But deep down, she knew she had to. She had to see the whole picture, to understand the bigger forces at play. There was no turning back now. The woman, the tall man, and Mr. Andrews were already inside, sitting around the large conference table. The receptionist took a deep breath and entered, her resolve strengthening with each passing second. As she stepped into the room, the energy shifted. There was an intensity in the air, an understanding that this was the moment when everything would finally be laid bare. The woman motioned for her to sit, her eyes filled with an almost unreadable expression. "You've come this far," she said. "And now, it's time for you to see the full picture." The receptionist sat down, her palms sweaty as she braced herself for what was coming next. The tall man remained silent, his gaze never wavering from the receptionist. Mr. Andrews, on the other hand, looked uneasy. The tension in the room was palpable, as if everyone knew that the truth, once revealed, would change everything. The woman spoke again, her voice steady and calm, yet laced with authority. "You've been part of this company for a long time, and you've seen things that most people never will. But there's one thing you didn't understand until now, the power has always been in the hands of a few. The people you thought were in charge are just pawns in a much larger game. And now, you've seen that for yourself." The receptionist's mind was racing. She had seen the cracks in the system, had sensed the power plays, but never had she understood the true depth of it. She had been living in a world of illusions, where her role was defined by the smallest of actions, the smallest of decisions. But now, she saw that everything was connected. Every move, every shift in power, had been part of a larger plan, a plan she had unknowingly been part of. The woman paused for a moment, letting the weight of her words sink in. The truth is, she continued, we all have a choice in this world. We can choose to stay blind, to live in the shadows of what others decide for us. Or we can choose to see the truth, to understand the forces that shape our lives, and use that knowledge to shape our own destiny. The receptionist looked at the woman, her eyes wide with understanding. The words were powerful, but they weren't just about business, they were about life. About the choices we make, the paths we take, and the way we allow others to control us. For the first time in a long while, the receptionist felt a sense of clarity. She wasn't just a pawn in someone else's game. She had the power to choose her own future. The woman had shown her that. She had opened her eyes to a world that was so much larger than the small corner she had once occupied. And as she sat there, listening to the woman's words, the receptionist realized that she no longer had to settle for a life defined by others. She could step into the light, take control, and carve her own path. The woman stood up, her eyes meeting the receptionist's with a quiet strength. You've learned your lesson, she said. The power is in your hands now. The choice is yours. The receptionist nodded slowly, her mind buzzing with new possibilities. She understood now that her past didn't define her future. The mistakes, the judgments, the fears, they were all part of a larger journey. And she was ready to move forward, with her eyes wide open, no longer blinded by assumptions. As she stood up to leave the room, the woman gave her one final piece of advice. Remember, life is full of choices. And the only way to truly change your destiny is to make the right ones. The receptionist walked out of the office, her heart filled with a sense of purpose she had never felt before. The road ahead wasn't easy, and there were still many questions to answer. But she knew now that she had the power to shape her own future, to take control of her life. And as she stepped into the world outside, she was no longer just a receptionist. She was a woman who understood the truth, and that truth would guide her every step forward.